starting from the southeast of Iran, Iran neighbors to Pakistan, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, and then in the north to Azerbaijan, Armenian, Turkey, and of course Iraq. And Iran shares a very long border with Iraq, about 1.5 thousand kilometers. So Iran is a huge country. And in terms of its population, the recent statistics tell us that its population is around 82 million people. So more or less the same as Turkey. And predominantly Persian is spoken in this country. Persian is the only official country of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Although there are other ethnic minorities, which according to some people are not really minorities, just like, for example, the Iranian Turks or Azeris, some of them at least Azeris, along with a relatively small number of Turkmens, and also Baluchis and Arabs and Kurds. We don't have the exact statistics regarding Iran's ethnic map because the Iranian regime or the Islamic Republic of Iran is not willing to share site-sensitive information with us and with the world. I also said in the beginning of my talk that Iran is one of the oldest civilizations in the world, and Iranians are often very much proud of it. They are very much proud of being one of the oldest civilizations of the world. It's believed universally that Iran's story of civilization started in 550 BC with Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Achaemenid dynasty. Don't be scared. I'm not going to talk about pre-Islamic Iran just for a few minutes, and then I will come to the modern period. So Cyrus the Great was the founder of the Achaemenid Empire, one of the oldest empires in the world, and he symbolized the height of Iranian civilization. During his time and during the age of the Achaemenid Empire, Iran reached to the largest territories and also reached to the zenith of its power. And after that, with Sassanids, Iranian territories and the power started to diminish substantially. And in 536, another turning point took place in Iran with the Islamic conquests. So Islam entered Iran through the Islamic armies. And from that time on, Iran started to become an Islamic nation or Islamic country slowly. This was a slow but a steady process, the Islamization of Iran. And as I often say, with the Islamic conquests, two things have never been the same, Iran and the Islamic world, which means these conquests transformed Iran significantly, made it an Islamic civilization instead of a Zoroastrian civilization or a pre-Islamic civilization. So Iran has never been the same again after the Islamic conquests. Second of all, the Islamic civilization has never been the same again with its penetration into Iran, because the Iranian civilization added substantially to the Islamic civilization. And just like, if you like to imagine, for example, you can imagine the penetration of Christianity into the Roman Empire. You can compare it to that, of course. I mean, I know there are two different cases, but the penetration of Christianity to the Roman Empire transformed both substantially, and this also took place in the case of Iran as well. So with Iran being increasingly Islamic country, Islamic civilization, it also added and contributed significantly to the Islamic civilization, especially in terms of literature. And not only literature, of course, in terms of sciences as well. Islamic sciences and also in terms of natural sciences like medicine. You all remember, of course, Ibn Sina and people like him who contributed a lot to our knowledge on philosophy, on medicine, on also Islamic sciences. And then another turning point took place again at the turn of the 13th century after the Mongol invasions. The children of Genghis, the Mongol emperor, transformed Iran into a Mongol empire, and Ilkhanid dynasty was founded in Iran at the turn of the 13th century in 1220. 1220, yes. And the Ilkhanid state also contributed a lot to Iran's civilization, architecture, philosophy, and also military power. But I am going to start my story not with the Ilkhanids and not definitely with Cyrus the Great. Our starting point is Shah Ismail Safavi, one of the most curious figures in early modern world, not also in the Middle East, but also in the world at large. Shah Ismail Safavi was a teenager when he became the Shah of Iran and when he created the Safavid dynasty in this vast country in 1501. This is the birth of the Safavid power in Iran. This is very important turning point for two main reasons. And the first reason is that until the coming of Shah Ismail and until the creation of the Safavid dynasty, the Ottoman Empire dominated Western Asia, just like Eurasian territories. But with the birth of the Safavid power, this power was shared between the Sunnite Ottomans and increasingly Shiite Iranians. Increasingly Shiite because the statistics tell us that although Shiites did live in Iran before Shah Ismail, but Shah Ismail was basically responsible for making Iran a Shiite country. So he made Shiism a state religion, and he made the Shiite making of Iran his main state policy. But Shah Ismail's dynasty was not a long-living dynasty. His dynasty collapsed due to the Afghan invasions in early 18th century, basically in 1722, with the fall of Isfahan, the capital of the Safavid Empire. From that time on, we see another figure, a very interesting one, named Nadir Shah. Nadir Shah created a very short-lived state No, they were not Shiites, Ismail. We know that Shah Ismail came from the lineage of Sheikh Safiuddin Erdebili. He was a sheikh. He was a head of Sufi or mystic lodge, and he was a Sunnite person. It's still debated among historians how this Safavid lineage came to turn into Islam by abandoning Sunnism. That's a very long story, and I'm not particularly an expert on that, but no, his grandfathers were not Shiite Muslims. They were according to every account, Sunnite Muslims, and you are most welcome, and they were mystics, mutasawwif. Okay, Nadir Shah, as I said, was a very interesting figure. He ruled in Iran for about 10 years, from 1736 until 1747. But this short period left huge impacts on Iranian history. because on the one hand, he saved Iran from destabilized atmosphere created by the fall of the Safavid dynasty. But on the other hand, with his death or assassination, horrible assassination of Nadir Shah in 1747, Iran experienced or suffered another destability almost in every part of the country. And then in 1796, Aga Muhammad Khan came to power and created what we know as the Qajar dynasty. The Qajar dynasty, just like Nadir Shah and just like Shah Ismail, they were Turks. And Aga Muhammad Khan created the Qajar dynasty in 1796. And from that time on until 1925, the Qajar dynasty survived in Iran for about 1.5 centuries. And what happened during this period? A lot of things happened during this period, during the entire 19th century when the Qajars ruled Iran. We know the story more or less about the Ottoman Empire, the modernization of the Ottoman Empire with the pressure of Europe, with after the military defeats and political pressure from Europe. Especially from Selim III, the Ottoman Empire started what we know as Nizam-i Jadid, or the New Order, a process which was accelerated with Mahmud II coming to power and taking these modernization policies even further in terms of military bureaucracy, in terms of state institutionalization, in terms of economic organization, etc., etc. And the proclamation of the Tanzimat in the Ottoman Empire was the height of this modernization or reform endeavors by the Ottoman reformists. A similar process took place in Iran, and here we have a very important date, 1828, the Treaty of Turkmenchai. Just like the Ottomans, Iranians have been fighting the Russians, and they were defeated against Russians several times. But the bitter defeat came in 1928. And the treaty imposed on Iran by the Russians, the Treaty of Turkmenchai or Turkmenchai, as it's known in the English literature, cost Iran significantly. Iran lost with this treaty the territories we know today as Azerbaijan Cumhuriyeti or the Republic of Azerbaijan, Armenistan, and parts of Georgia or Gurjistan. So Iran lost most of its Caucasian territories with this treaty of Turkmenchai. This, of course, was a shock and a humiliation for the Iranians. And this was followed by a series of reforms in the military, in the political institutions, and also in economic institutions as well. But none of them reached to the success of the Ottoman Empire. So if you like to compare the modernization of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century with that of Iran in the 19th century, the Ottomans proved to be more successful in adapting the European model of an army, a European model of state organization, and European model of economic development, of course, to some extent. Iran was not so successful, and there were a number of reasons for that. First of all, the Qajars, as the principal power and as the holder of real power in Iran, they were never as powerful as the Ottoman court. So the Qajars were challenged not only from outside, but also from inside by other tribes, because Iran was and has been for ages a tribal country. And other tribes challenged the power of the Qajars during the 19th century as well. They were Turks. Yes. Although their origin is still debated, some believe they were August Turks. Some people believe that they came from the line of Timur, but they were Turks. Just like, as I said, Nadir Shah was a Turk, the Afsharids were Turks, and also Shah Ismail were definitely Turks, August Turks. But there were also other tribes in Iran. Some of them were Turks, some of them were non-Turks, like the Arabic tribes, for example, in South, definitely the Safavid dynasty. The Safavids were a lot more powerful than the Qajars, even by far. Because the Qajars did not survive as long as the Safavids, and also in terms of like getting their power accepted throughout the country, the Qajars were never as successful as the Safavids. So the Safavids were a lot more powerful than the Qajars. And in 1891, another significant turning point took place in Iran, which is known as Tütün İsyanı, or Tobacco Rebellion in Iranian history, or Tobacco Movement in Iranian history. You may think this was an insignificant, even a usual popular protest against the Qajar monarchs Nasruddin Shah, but it proved not to be so insignificant. And what was it about? In Yes, yes, definitely. And in 1889, Nasruddin Shah gave a concession, imtiyaz, a concession, an economic concession to a British national for the production, for the export of Iranian tobacco. And this created an immense frustration among merchants, among farmers, and they started a rebellion or a movement known as the Tobacco Movement of 1891. And at the end of the movement, the Shah was forced to cancel the concession. So he basically canceled the concession and paid a huge money to the holder of the concession for canceling the concession. But why it was so important? Because this tobacco movement took place as a social movement in which the mullahs, or the Shiite clergy, or the Shiite Muslim scholars, the secular intellectuals, Roshan Fikran, as they call them in Persian, merchants and guildsmen, they took place in the social movement. And the movement became so successful that with the fatwa of one of these mullahs, Sayyid Hasan Shirazi, who said that if this concession was not cancelled, the use and the production of tobacco was haram, forbidden by the decree of the hidden Imam, the Mahdi of the Shiite Muslims. He said, so you cannot use tobacco, you cannot produce tobacco unless this concession is cancelled. It was so influential, this fatwa, that even the women in the harem of Nasruddin Shah left or abandoned using tobacco. They stopped using tobacco as pious Muslims. And so Nasruddin Shah found himself in a crisis, and he finally canceled the tobacco concession. So now, why this type of a social movement was so significant? And we saw that in 1906. In 1906, Iran experienced the first revolution in its history, in its modern history. and also since revolutions are modern phenomena, which means that it was the first revolution in Iranian history, the constitutional revolution. And the name speaks of constitutional revolution means a revolution for a constitution. So the revolutionaries basically they asked for a constitution. They wanted a constitution. But why do they want it for a constitution? Actually, we know that from the Ottoman history. The Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Sultan Abdülhamit II proclaimed.
Bizdeki meşrutiyet oluyor değil mi hocam?
Yes, the
Daha
meşrut.
şartlı, kala bağlı
Yes.
bir.
Yes, and what we know as Meşrutiyet Devrimi, it's İnkılab-ı Meşrute, or the Constitutional Revolution in Iran, which means basically that there is a monarch who is an absolute monarch, an absolute meaning that at least on paper, he could do anything he wanted. He could kill someone, execute someone. He could take any policy decisions to his desire, etc. This is what we call absolute monarchy, right? And some people came and said that we don't want this. They said we want to know our responsibilities and also our rights. So we want the monarch, the Shah, to be confined, to be limited by a number of principles, which we call a constitution. Okay, so this is what we basically call constitutional revolution. And constitutional revolutions in modern times, as you know, were inspired by the French Revolution of 1789, because the French Revolution gave birth to the idea that no country should be governed by an absolute monarch. People or the popular opinion should have a say in decision-making processes. Okay, and throughout the 19th century, you have different constitutional revolutions almost all over the world, in Mexico, in Portugal, for example, and definitely in Russia, especially the Russian Revolution for a Duma in 1905 was very significant. It inspired the Turks in the Ottoman Empire, or the Ottomans in the Ottoman Empire, and also Iranians in Iran. Also, interestingly enough, a war broke out in 1905 between Japan and Russia. And at that time, Russia was still an absolute monarchy, Tsarist empire. So the Tsar ruled Russia. But in this war of 1905, the Japanese defeated the Russians. It was very interesting because Russia, especially from the period of Petro the Great, was believed to be a European empire. So an Asian power, Japan, defeated a giant European empire in a war. So this was a clear message to the people of Asia. But there was another message. Japan was a constitutional monarchy, unlike the Tsarist Russia of the time. So the message was clear. If you are a constitutional monarchy, you become better off and you can develop better. So a constitutional monarchy is better than an absolute monarchy. Okay, so this also was very influential among Iranian revolutionaries. And ultimately, the Iranian constitutional revolution took place in 1906. What happened with this constitutional revolution? Please note this constitutional revolution because we will use it again a few minutes later. With the constitutional revolution, two things took place. First, a constitution was proclaimed. It was based on the Belgian constitution. It was Iranized in some sense. Some additions were made to it, but it was based on the Belgian constitution. So a constitution was proclaimed. This was the first outcome of the revolution. And second, a majlis, or a parliament, was opened. They called it Meclisi Şurayı Milli, a National Consultative Assembly. Okay, so the same name as the Ottomans. They also called it Meclis, Meclis Mebusan. So for the first time in Iran's history, a constitution was proclaimed and a Meclis was opened where people sent their deputies to make decisions on their behalf. Okay, so it was very important. But 1 year after this revolution, an equally important development took place. Some of those people, again in this constitutional revolution, the mullahs, the religious scholars, Rushan Fikran, or the intellectuals, ordinary people, merchants, they also took place in it, just like the tobacco movement. So this is why tobacco movement came to be so significant. But after the proclamation of the Constitution in 1906, conflict started within the revolutionaries, within those people who contributed to the constitutional revolution. And the discussion was, or the fight, I think it was more a fight rather than a discussion. The fight was around the place of Islam in the state. So some of the mullahs, some of the religious scholars, most prominently, one of them, Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri, a senior scholar, a senior mullah of the early 20th century, he said, sorry guys, okay, now we have a constitution, so we have a nizam mashruti, we have a constitutional regime, but where is Islam in it? He said, we are a Muslim nation, and this nation should be ruled by the rules of Islam. And in 1907, an amendment was made to the Constitution. So a number of new articles were added to the Constitution. And one of those articles was especially significant because according to that article, 5 mullahs or 5 religious scholars were obtained to investigate the laws in terms of their compatibility with Islam. So basically, according to this amendment, no laws which was contrary to Islamic rules could be passed from the parliament. Okay, and for the rest of the story, the fight went on, and this Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri was later on executed after another significant conflict within the revolutionaries. But that is not important. What is important is that this article in the Constitution, 1906 article, along with the amendments in 1907, stayed there for the rest of the century until 1997, the Islamic Revolution. Okay, this is very important, which means this constitution was not changed by the Pahlavi regime. This is very important. So the constitution of 1906, along with the additions in 1907, stayed in place for the rest of the 20th century. And then after 1907, Iran again became more of a destabilized country. And with the eruption of the First World War in 1914, Iran stayed away from the war. So Iran remained neutral during the war, but Iran was also devastated by the war, not militarily, but politically and economically. So when the war ended in 1918, Iran was stuck in a chaos. A number of separatist movements took place in northern Iran, for example, the Jangeli movement or the Forest movement led by Mirza Küçük Khan, and also the Khiyabani movement in Iran. A powerful leader, according to many people, was needed to recover Iran from destabilization, economic poverty, etc., etc. And then Reza Shah came to power. So, of course, he came to power as Reza Khan for the first time in 1921. in what is known in Iranian history as coup d'etat. Yes, actually, this Khan has a lot of different usages, but the common point is that it is a military name given to certain people. So if you are a Khan, that means that you have some kind of military power. But the exact, yes, you are a warrior and even some kind of a commander. Okay, so its usage differs from the Ottomans to the Iranians, but the common ground is that it's a military title, not given to everybody, definitely not given to civilians. And Reza Khan was one of the officers in the Cossack brigades or Kazakh taburları, which were mainly responsible for protecting Tehran and also the Qajar court. And when he made this military coup d'etat in 1921, he first became the Minister of War, or Vezir-i Jang, and later on he became the Prime Minister. And then, as you all know, in 1925, Reza Khan abolished, he canceled the Qajar dynasty and created his own dynasty known as Pahlavi dynasty. Okay, so from 1925 onwards, we don't have the Qajars anymore. They are gone. They left the Ahmed Shah, the last Qajar Shah, left for Italy, and he died in Italy. He was very sick, he was very young, he was a very incapable man, and he left because just like in Turkey, they were forced into exile. And in Iran, Mohammed Reza Khan created his own dynasty, which he called Pahlavi dynasty, and became the first Shah of the Pahlavi dynasty. Reza Shah period
The help of British.
with the help of the British, definitely. I mean, he's
By
coming.
by.
Yes, I mean, his coming to power in the first place in 1921 was backed by the British, and also his creation of his dynasty was supported in some way or the other by the British, or was tolerated by the British, so to speak. I'm not going to go into the time of Reza Shah because it's a very long story. When the war broke out, the second one in 1939, Reza Shah backed or supported the Germans, although indirectly. But the British and the Russians were very resented. They were very angry about that. And in 1941, they invaded Tehran and they told to Reza Shah, they said, you have two options. We either can destroy your dynasty, so your dynasty will be gone, or you can leave and your son can take your place. And he accepted the second option and he went into exile to South Africa, to Johannesburg.
After giving the all kinds of concessions.
To
Bundan bir
whom?
sürü taviz alıyorlar.
Definitely. I mean, that is, yes, definitely. That is the core of the story, actually. So Reza Shah leaves Iran in 1941, and he dies in exile a few years later. And then Mohammad Reza Shah, his son, takes power, and he was 22 years old when he became the second Shah of the dynasty, second and the last. So Iran came under the influence of first the British, even more. And then when the war ended, Iran came under the influence of the US, America, especially during the period of the Cold War. The Americans supported Iran, supported Mohammad Reza Shah, so much so that when Mohammad Mossadegh, a popular, significant prime minister, he was elected prime minister in 1951, shortly after the nationalization of Iranian oil, after the battle or after the fight or the conflict with the British. So he became prime minister in 1951. But the British never liked the man. They never liked Mohammad Mossadegh. He was popularly supported. People supported him, liked him, but the British didn't like him. and also Shah hated him. And in 1923, as another significant turning point in Iranian history took place, what we know as Operation Ajax. A coup d'etat took place against Mohammad Mossadegh with the help of the CIA and also MI6. So with the help of the intelligence services of the British and Americans. Mohammad Mossadegh was toppled, he was overthrown, he was taken to the court, tried, and he was put into house arrest for more than 10 years. So he was out of the game, simply. And when Mohammad Mossadegh was gone, this was a huge relief for Mohammad Reza Shah. So after 1953, Mohammad Reza Shah ruled without any challenge until of course, 1964. In 1964, Mohammad Reza Shah faced another and more important challenge, this time from a mullah named Ayatollah Khomeini. And the basis of this challenge was very shortly. In 1963, Mohammad Reza Shah proclaimed a revolution, which he called the Revolution of the Shah and his people, İnkılab-ı Şah ve Merdom, or better known in Iranian history as the White Revolution, İnkılab-ı Sefid. So he came with a revolution, and he said this revolution was a huge step forward, a leap forward towards modernization. What was in it? A lot of things were put in this revolution. The land reform, which is a very long story, so I pardon your excuses not to go into that, because that's a very long story. Extending suffrage to women, universal education, and from the perspective of Ayatollah Khomeini as a conservative person, this was a fight against the conservative values of Iran. And he stood up and he spoke against this revolution. He was put into jail, and then people poured into the streets in defense of Ayatollah Khomeini. The Shah was forced to let him go. And then 1 year later, in 1964, Khomeini spoke against the Shah again. This time he was even more harsher. He criticized the Shah harshly. And then the Shah sent Khomeini into exile in 1964. He sent him first to Bursa, to Turkey, for less than a year. So Ayatollah Khomeini stayed in Bursa for less than a year. And then he went to Najaf in Iraq to stay there until 1978. Khomeini stayed in Najaf, he taught in Najaf, he gave lessons in Najaf, and at the same time he continued his campaign against the Shah from Najaf. He spoke, he published, he made declarations against the Shah. And